And these are words from bell hooks. Let me be a witness to love. Stand on the outside and see tenderness unbidden, kind words, and a lover's sweet touch. Let me be a witness to love. See each sacrifice surrendered, how patient and joined, such open heart. Let me see and then believe.
So each week we take time in our service to see each other, to believe, to share moments of joy, of sorrow, the moments that make up our lives week to week, day to day. If you have a joy or a sorrow to share, Byron will bring you the mic here at the community center. Please say your name and then briefly share your joy or your sorrow. Keeping in mind our time together is short, and Amy and I have a lot of material to get through. If you have something online, if you're online, wave, type it in the chat. You can jump up and down there too, but I can't promise we'll actually notice that.
Hi, my name is Polly. I have great news this week. I started a new job.
Yes!
It was awesome. They hired me right out of the interview. I was
Very
like,
smart of them.
No, I was like, suckers. Anyways, much better working conditions. It's a diverse workplace. I feel accepted and wanted, and that's going to be really nice. So thank you for all your support.
I just want to have you hold in your hearts a friend from the horse barn. They were in an accident some time ago where they were turning into their driveway and it was quite dark. And the other driver did not have his lights on and was drunk. Mm. He was killed. The husband and the daughter were bruised up. The son had a broken clavicle. My friend has had knee surgery and she has to have a plate put in her sternum. But the saddest part is that she was an only child and her mother died during COVID because she couldn't get medical care for her cardiac issues. And so she posted on Facebook that she's missing her mother, which brought all this back to me. So if you could hold that family in your hearts.
I'm Marie, and I am happy to say that on Monday for Memorial Day, last minute, I asked my sibs to come over to my house and have a picnic, and they're going to. I'm just really happy because through our history as siblings, we haven't always gotten together, and we've been much more connected, and that feels really, really good.
I'm Marty, and I would like to say that we had a wonderful day yesterday with Ed and Kathy Burek at their house. They had a brunch that was offered at, I think, at a service auction before COVID. I don't know, a long time ago, I think. And anyhow, there were 8 of us guests there, and we had a wonderful time at their home with that delicious food.
I'm Katie. I have 1 here and 2 that I'll read from the chat. So our daughter Andrea, some of you know, graduated college, almost, a few years ago. And a few years ago? A few weeks ago. But I'm...
Wow, I just aged a lot.
Sure, sorry. I am, the joy is that after graduation, she got a little trip to New Zealand and with a friend of hers, and she did actually manage to come home yesterday, which there was some mix up with flights for a while, so I'm glad that she did make it home. And online, Richard Harju says that he spent 5 days in the hospital on heart-related issues. He's staying with his friend and working on the heart problems. And Pamela says, my cat Zeke is very sick and is presumed to have pancreatitis. He is on meds to control pain and nausea. And that's what I see in the chat, and I'm not seeing any hands raised.
Here is something I know love creates. Space. Space for joy, for sorrow, space for the ordinary, the everyday, for quiet chuckles, raucous laughter, for that deep and resonating silence. Space to be filled, to be crossed by the very love that creates it. So let us hold this space for gifts of new opportunities, for reconnection with family, for recovery and holding friends, for the pending loss of a loved pet, for a little bit of jealousy for a trip to New Zealand, and for all of the joys and the sorrows and just the moments of meaning that go unspoken. Let us take a moment of quiet prayer and meditation. I forgot to say in the announcement that the flowers this week come from 1995. These are Amy's wedding bouquet that have been sitting on a shelf in our house for 24 years. They are, as Amy noted yesterday, faded, but that's okay because so are we. Love creates the way that we connect and communicate with each other. Or maybe, as couples therapist Esther Perel writes, it's the other way around. That the things we do, the way we act, these verbs create and shape the way love shows up in our lives. Now, as a person who speaks 9 languages, Perel says, Perel, not me, Perel says that she has learned how important it is to practice the basic verbs of a new language. These are the first we learn for speech, and I've come to believe they are also the first we learn in love. I pay special attention to 7. To ask, to take, to receive, to give, to share, to refuse, to play, and imagine. Play nice. All right.
So now we have a story for all ages. I was a little hesitant to do this story today because it's a very wintry story, and I'm like, no, we finally have summer. But It's just too wonderful not to do. So a hat for Mrs. Goldman. When Sophia was a tiny baby, Mrs. Goldman next door knit her a tiny baby hat to keep her warm. Now Sophia is big, and she makes the pom-poms for Mrs. Goldman's hats. Hats for the tiniest babies. Hats for small, medium, and large friends and neighbors. Mrs. Goldman taught her how. Keeping kepis warm is our mitzvah, says Mrs. Goldman, kissing the top of Sophia's head. This is your kepi, and a mitzvah is a good deed. Sophia and Mrs. Goldman bundle up to walk Mrs. Goldman's dog, Fifi. Winter is almost here. Fifi wears her dinosaur sweater. Sophia wears her fuzzy kitten hat and matching mittens. Mrs. Goldman made them all. An icy wind blows Mrs. Goldman's hair left and right. It turns her ears pink. "Where's your hat?" asks Sophia. "I gave it to Mrs. Chen," she explains. "Mrs. Goldman's kepi must be cold," worries Sophia. At home, Sophia thinks and worries again. Worries and thinks. Mrs. Goldman needs a hat. Who will knit one for her? Not Mrs. Goldman. She's too busy knitting for everyone else. Last year, Mrs. Goldman taught Sophia how to knit. "I only like making pom-poms," decided Sophia after a few days. "Knitting is hard, and it takes too long." Now Sophia digs out the knitting bag Mrs. Goldman gave her, and the hat they started. The stitches are straight and even. The soft wool smells like Mrs. Goldman's chicken soup. Sophia holds the needles and tries to remember what to do. She drops one stitch, she drops another. Still, Sophia knits on. She wants to make Mrs. Goldman the most special hat in the world. The next day, when Sophia and Mrs. Goldman walk Fifi, tiny fluffs of snow fall on Mrs. Goldman's head. Her ears are bright red. "Mrs. Goldman's kepi must be very cold," frets Sophia. Sophia knits after breakfast. She knits after lunch. She knits after dinner. She even knits while Mama reads her a bedtime story. But Sophia does not knit when she is at Mrs. Goldman's house. The hat is a surprise. All week, there's frost on the windows. One day when they are walking Fifi, Mrs. Goldman wraps Mr. Goldman's scarf around her head like she's a mummy. A fierce wind unwraps it and flings it up high. Sophia jumps up and grabs an end of the scarf. Fifi nips at the other end. "Mrs. Goldman's kepi must be freezing," shivers Sophia. Sophia knits and knits and knits, faster and faster and faster. Stitch by stitch, row by row. Then Sophia sews. At last, Mrs. Goldman's hat is done. Sort of. The hat is lumpy and bumpy. There are holes where there shouldn't be holes. It looks like a monster hat, thinks Sophia. Sophia turns the hat over and around, inside out. Mrs. Goldman's hat should not be a monster hat that will scare Fifi. Sophia opens the box of hats Mrs. Goldman made her. Each one is special, but they are all too small for Sophia now, and way too small for Mrs. Goldman. Sophia looks in the hall closet. There are lots of hats Mrs. Goldman made for Mama and Papa, but she can't give her their hats. There's a scratchy old hat Sophia's abuela wore back in Mexico. Worse than Mr. Goldman's scarf. Sophia thinks about Mrs. Goldman and the hats they make together. Your pom-poms add beauty, Mrs. Goldman always tells her. And that's a mitzvah too. Sophia feels her heart grow bigger and lighter, like a balloon. She searches her room for red yarn. Red is Mrs. Goldman's favorite color. She gathers her scissors, her sewing needle, and her stack of index cards. Sophia gets busy, very busy. When Sophia is done, Mrs. Goldman's hat is the most special hat in the world. Sophia rushes next door. Surprise! For me? Asks Mrs. Goldman. For you, answers Sophia. It's a hat, she says. Well, of course it is, exclaims Mrs. Goldman, and she hugs Sophia, and then she cries. What's wrong? Asks Sophia. Don't you like it? I more than like it. I love it, declares Mrs. Goldman. It's gorgeous, like Mr. Goldman's rose bushes. And you know how I love his roses. Mrs. Goldman kisses Sophia on top of her kepi. I made it all by myself, Sophia tells her. Amazing. And will you look at all these pom-poms? 1, 2, 3, 4, counts Mrs. Goldman. Sophia joins in. There are 20 pom-poms on Mrs. Goldman's hat, each one made with love. She gently puts her hat on. The next day, Sophia and Mrs. Goldman walk Fifi. Fifi wears her dinosaur sweater. Sophia wears her fuzzy kitten hat and matching mittens. Mrs. Goldman wears her Sophia hat. Her kepi is toasty warm, and that's a mitzvah.
So part of the reason that Amy reads the stories every week when I do a service is because she's good at it, right? The other part is I would be crying halfway through and it would be hard to finish. So, and every now and then we have a little debate over who's going to have to read something. I read that one yesterday. I'm like, yep, we're doing that, but I can't possibly read it. So love, Sophia learns, is revealed in verbs, in pom-poms, in what we create, in what we do, but not just in the things we do. Love shows us, inspires us. What love creates is a way. I recently discovered a Unitarian hymn from Hungary. It's in our Teal hymnal, it's number 1043, and the song translates as, where there is faith, there is love. Where there is love, there is peace. Where there is peace, there is blessing. Where there is blessing, there is God. Where there is God, there is no need. In her Notes from the Far Fringe blog, Reverend Kimberly Davis, I think, I've never talked to her. Davis, we'll go with that, wrote that this might be her favorite song in the Teal hymnal. Not because she thinks it's a good one to sing as a congregation, because it's actually very difficult, but because of the way it holds up love, not as an end in itself, but as a path. What I especially love, she writes, is the idea that love isn't the end. We often rely on love first and last, helped along by our universalist assertions that God is love, and thus ultimate. No, in this understanding, love leads to peace, leads to blessing, leads to God or mystery. But it begins with faith. Simple, impossible faith. Yeah, that'll preach.
We're made for each other. Really? I think This saying is supposed to be romantic, but it doesn't feel meaningful or desirable to me. I don't want to yuck anyone's yum. If you feel this saying represents your relationship or something you aspire to, who am I to be snarky about that? But to me, it suggests passivity and effortlessness that I don't associate with love or relationships. At some point, Chad and I came up with our own version of this saying, which we're not in total agreement about what it is. But we're going to go with this for today. So we like to say, we've made each other for each other. What's the difference? I think our version, or versions, reject the idea that there is some cosmic plan for our coupledness. We're not meant to be. Instead, it focuses on chance and choice. Somehow our paths crossed, and forces we couldn't control, as well as some forces we could, have led to our relationship to feel right and normal and relatively easy, most days. Saying we've made each other for each other also highlights that we've grown and evolved together, made compromises big and small. We don't usually notice this process, and when we do, we mostly feel it's been a gift. We've become better and more because we're part of this thing that's a combination of both of us. But sometimes we feel annoyed and even angry. Sometimes feeling like you've changed because of another person, even if you wanted to, even if you've chosen to, feels like a loss. Sometimes we say, no, I'm not going to change, or I'm not going to expect you to change. I don't think we make ourselves and each other only for romantic relationships, but all relationships, with other individuals, communities, and our social and physical environments. Sometimes we're remade without having many good options or the ability to put on the brakes. I like the possibilities and nuances I find in saying we've made each other for each other. But as I'm thinking about all of this, I realize that it isn't the best way to describe how love changes us and gives us the power to change one another. Because we're never made. As the proposed change to Article 2 points out, we're never finished or perfect. Nothing is. Yes, Chad and I have made ourselves for each other to get to this point, but we're not done. We're making ourselves for each other. And the emphasis there is making. We're continuing to choose and to be changed and to be a catalyst for change as we create new versions of ourselves as individuals, and this additional thing, we call it Cheney, we make together. Not only do I feel like I'm remaking myself so I can be in a long-term relationship with Chad, but so I can be a part of MSUS too. Sometimes being a member of the MSUS community feels effortless, and I can't imagine a reality where MSUS isn't a huge part of my life. Sometimes being a part of this community feels like a challenge or a burden or a catalyst for me to be something different. Change is because of someone, by and with someone, and changing others, and changing together, and even saying no to change that isn't right for you. That is part of the path love creates, if we choose to follow it. At least, my time loving Chad and loving MSUS has made me think that.